Section 1 of 11 Stories by Ray Hasse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Cinda J. M. 11 Stories by Ray Hasse. Proktols of Neptune. Part 1. Space rumor had spun wild tales of horror about Neptune's almost legendary race of Proktols, but what could rumor know of this hideous reality that faced Space Captain Janus and his captive crew? Commander Janus stared in bafflement at the power board of the patrol ship Wasp. The deflector needle was still gyrating wildly. That had begun 5 minutes ago. His lips tightened, and he looked up irritably as the first mate peered inquisitively over his shoulder. "Better check up on the course again, De Vries." "Just did, sir. We're .00 perfect. Not the slightest aberrancy." Janus swore under his breath. "I just can't figure it. Must be some object dead ahead to cause this disturbance, but why doesn't our deflector beam shunt it from us or pivot us around it?" He paced the control room, stopped, and looked over at Kettrick, whose eyes were fixed steadily on the visipanel. "See anything yet?" Kettrick merely shook his head, not looking up. The panel magnified their course several times, and Kettrick had the sharpest eyes in the patrol. "Damned if I like it a bit," Janus muttered, staring again at the crazy needle that seemed about to jump its bearings. "De Vries, tell Blake to cut all the jets. We better go into a drift until we're a little better able to determine what's wrong." De Vries stepped to the tube and gave the order to Blake in the rocket room. A moment later, the Wasp was in the drift. Blake came forward to see what was up. Far behind rolled the hideous green ball that was Neptune, and immeasurably far ahead somewhere was Pluto. De Vries stepped again to the chart and saw that the hairline indicator still had Pluto right on the nose. "I think I've got something," Kettrick spoke from the panel. The men crowded around him, peering into the square of blackness that seemed to swim as Kettrick turned the magnifying dial. "I see it," Blake exclaimed. A meteor? Looks like it's drifting right at us." But Kettrick shook his head and his eyes narrowed. "That looks to me like a derelict, and it's my opinion that we're drifting at it." "A spacer?" Commander Janus asked excitedly. "Can you make it out, Kettrick? Maybe it's Perrin? I hope to God it is. It'll save us days." But the next few minutes revealed that it wasn't Perrin's pirate ship. The drifting spacer was much larger and of different design, with no name or emblem of any kind, and it was solid black, preventing easy detection against the blackness of space. "It's a derelict, all right," De Vries said. "See that ragged gap in the hull near the stern?" He pointed, and the others crowded around to look. He was right. In the side of the hull near the stern was a great jagged hole that looked as though it had been made by either a collision with a rogue meteor or the blast of a space cannon. They watched in silence as the strange craft drifted toward them. There was no sign of life aboard her, no attempts at communication or establishing her identity. Quite obviously, the craft was deserted. De Vries didn't like the look of it one bit and said so. It loomed up larger and larger as the tiny Wasp was drawn swiftly to it. Then, with a little shock, the Wasp clanged against the strange ship's side and clung there. The crew moved for the spacesuits. Commander Janus snapped, "Wait a minute!" He stood there frowning, his gray hair bristling. "Something funny here. We better go slow." His eyes were troubled. "But a derelict, sir," Blake said. "Space code says we're obliged to board her, examine her log." "Don't quote me the space code," Janus snapped. "Point is she a derelict? Maybe you failed to notice we didn't drift to her by natural attraction. We were pulled. Someone left on her magna plates. Why?" "Could have been an accident," Blake suggested. Janus shook his head. "Another thing. Her outer lock is open, and we landed smack against it. All we've got to do is step over. How extraordinarily convenient. Kettrick peered through the turret at the black derelict. Say, you're right. He grinned, started to quote an ancient nursery rhyme. Walk into my parlor, said the spider. He stopped suddenly, aware of young Ross standing there with eyes aglow and eager. Ross was the novice member. The space ennui had begun to get to him, so Janice had ordered him to his cabin to sleep it off. Once the ennui gets a grip on a man in vast outer spaces, he's not much good for anything, even though he might be a good spaceman in the inner planets. Now Janice made up his mind, turned to him. Ross, we're going across. You stand by the controls. Keep your eyes open and your hand on the portable atom blast. Ross showed his disappointment, but obeyed orders. My hunch may be wrong, Janice warned, but we'd better be careful anyway. The men didn't need his admonition. As they passed out of the Wasp's lock and into the other, their hands all hovered around their atom blasts, and the moment they stepped into the alien spacer, they knew Janice's hunch hadn't been wrong. Looking down a long, empty corridor, they saw a barred door. Beyond that door was the stern compartment where the gap was in the metal hull, but the rest of the spacer was still airtight. Janice flashed them a look that said, "See?" They threw back their helmets. Soundlessly, they walked toward the bow, listening intently for any signs of life. They passed some narrow cross corridors and many doors, all tightly closed. Devries, bringing up the rear, glanced behind him occasionally. Nothing. Nevertheless, he shivered. There was a jittery tension in the very air. They came in sight of the navigation room and stopped suddenly. Janice stared at the odd-looking controls. I never saw a spacer like this before, he whispered. The voice behind him didn't whisper. It rang hollowly down the long corridor. No, I am sure you did not. Do not go any farther, please. The four men whirled. It was a mystery where they came from, those dozen fantastic beings behind them. They had heard no steps, no sound of a door opening. Devries was nearest. His first startled impression was that they weren't more than semi-human, as tall as a man but much thinner, with flexible, wiry limbs, absurdly large heads, quite hairless and glistening, from which protruded frail antennae, eyes huge, lidless, and staring, no perceptible noses, mouths but thin gashes. Most striking of all, their entire skin shimmered with a metallic reddish-brown luster, although the Earthmen learned later it was not metallic but shell-like. Kettrick was always reckless. His hand flew to his atom blast. Much faster, the nearest of the creatures raised a flame pistol. The charge passed so close to Kettrick's body it scorched his suit. Kettrick changed his mind, and the creature said, "That is better." "Take it easy," Janice warned, still whispering. "We're in their trap now." The creatures had keen hearing. "Indeed you are, Commander Janice," said the one with the flame pistol, apparently the leader. And it was so simple it was almost childish. "But you Earthmen are always so noble, with what you call a space code, always ready to go to the aid of a helpless derelict. Or is it merely curiosity? The Martians are not so stupid, they never go prying." The insult was lost on Janice, who stared. "How do you know my name?" he demanded. The creature spoke perfect English, but the voice was toneless and the words precise, clipped. "That does not matter. It is my business to know certain things." "Well, I'm sorry to say I don't know as much about you." Janice eyed the flame pistol angrily. "Kindly state your business with us. We're from the Earth Patrol, an official—" "Yes, I know. In search of one of your race, a pirate, one whom you call Perrin. I have heard of this Perrin." The creature's facial expression didn't change, but the wide blackness of his staring eyes turned to a momentary angry orange, then back to black. He went on in his cold voice. "I have not introduced myself. I am known as Vernarek. If you wish to know more about us, I think your friend there can tell you. It would be amusing to hear about us from his lips." The men were amazed as the creature gestured toward De Vries with a pistol. Again the eyes changed color, this time to a soft green, which must have signified amusement. Had the creature read De Vries' mind? Yes, he knew them, or rather he'd heard something about them. This was the first one he'd actually seen. "We're in a spot now," he said in a low tone to his friends. "Those are the Proktols, inhabitants of the single moon of Neptune. They usually stick pretty close to home, but once they go on the warpath, or rather the space path, you can bet something's up." Yes, go on," said Van Arik in his clipped voice, his eyes still green with amusement. But at that moment the men heard the inner lock clang shut and a sudden roar of the rockets. Too late they realized Van Arik had held their attention with conversation while a few of his men sneaked off to get the spacer underway. They leapt to the ports, saw the Wasp drifting free. They saw something else. A flame leapt from this ship, touched the Wasp and lingered there. A circular spot on its silvery hull glowed suddenly red. Ross was frantically trying to swing the Wasp away. "Good Lord, Ross!" Janice sprang toward Van Arik and clutched at him. "Stop it! One of our men is still aboard back there!" Van Arik deliberately turned his back. They saw the thin shell of the Wasp burst outward. "You murdering devils!" yelled Kettrick, suddenly berserk. He leapt toward Van Arik in blind fury, reaching out with his hands. Van Arik stepped aside, brought up his flame pistol, and calmly crashed the butt of it down upon Kettrick's head. Kettrick crumpled. Van Arik turned to De Vries, casually, his eyes now black and placid. "You were saying?" De Vries went numb. He could only barely feel Blake's and Janice's hands restraining him as he tried to leap forward, but his brain was a searing thing of fire. "I was saying you're a blight on the universe, you damned unholy devils!" he shrieked. "You scum! You spawn of hell! You're unfit to inhabit the same space with decent men. I know what you do. I've heard all about you. If I ever get back to Earth, I'll bring men out here to blast your filthy planet from the skies." He shrieked other things, shrieked till his throat was raw. When the red mist cleared from before De Vries' eyes, he saw Van Arik standing there complacently with his men around him. Van Arik opened his gash of a mouth. He uttered 4 sentences in that emotionless, precise English. "I am really disappointed. You do not half do us justice. We are actually much worse than you paint us. I think you will soon have occasion to realize that." He turned and gestured to his men. They came forward, wrapped their wiry arms around the Earthmen, and hustled them down a narrow corridor. They thrust them in an empty room, but kept their atom blasts, which they examined curiously. They dumped the unconscious Kettrick on the floor. The door clanged shut. The Earthmen felt a faint vibration in the bare metal walls as rockets thundered, sending the alien spacer surging ahead. They managed to revive Kettrick after a while. Then they all looked questioningly at De Vries. De Vries sank down on the floor, bowed his head in his hands, and groaned. "Lord, what a spot to be in. I guess I let loose with some utter gibberish out there. I don't remember all that I yelled, but you wouldn't blame me if you knew what we're probably in for." "I could make a good guess," Blake said, grinning wryly. "No, you couldn't," De Vries said, so solemnly that Blake's grin vanished. "Commander Janice, I noticed you made a wide sweep away from Neptune. I'll bet you had orders to stay clear of there. Am I right?" Janice nodded affirmatively, startled. "I thought so. And didn't you wonder why?" "It's not for me to wonder," replied Janice. "There are standing orders that Neptune's utterly unfit, uninhabitable, no reason to land there." De Vries nodded grimly. "All right, and now I'll tell you something. Neptune's not uninhabitable. At least its moon is not. For these Proktols live there, and where they can live, Earthmen can live. But spacemen usually give Neptune a wide beam, at least those who have heard the rumor. I first heard it in a spacefront dive on Mars a few years ago from a drunk half-breed Martian. He and 2 companions had been inward bound from Pluto. They set down on Neptune's moon for rocket repair. The Proktols got them and hauled them off to their capital city. There, before a vast populace, they tortured 2 of the men horribly. The 3rd Martian managed to escape to his ship and made it back to Mars alone. Blake was aghast. These Proktols did that? These things that have got us now? Yes, DeVries nodded. But why? I don't know. The Martian who told me this didn't seem to know himself. Bunk, Janice pronounced. No one tortures men without any reason, not even these Proktols. But maybe they do have a reason, DeVries replied. Oh, I'll admit at first I didn't believe that Martian story myself. I thought it was the effect of the tzatzith he was drinking, and God knows he needed it, poor devil. But when I looked into his eyes, they weren't the kind of eyes I'd ever seen in a Martian or anyone else. They were mad eyes, mad with the sight they had looked upon. You said there were rumors, Kettrick spoke up. I never heard of these Proktols before, much less any rumors about them. DeVries looked at Kettrick. I told you they stayed close to home, but you know how many men from the inner planets have come out here, never to be heard of again? After that Martian story, I made inquiries, mostly from hardened independent spacemen. I went about the lowest dives of Mars, whispering surreptitiously about Proktols. Out of 100 I approached, only 3 men seemed to know what I was talking about. 2 of these turned a funny color and muttered something and hurried away from me. Their silence was the best eloquence. The 3rd man told me a vague, similar story to that of the Martians. This torture the Proktols seem so fond of, Kettrick sneered. Tell us about that. Well, it's... DeVries tried to tell them, but he couldn't. That mad Martian had painted him a picture that rose up now in his brain and flooded it with horror. He was suddenly sick. He couldn't speak, and he wished he couldn't think. He simply rolled over and lay there with his face to the wall. The others were suddenly silent. Blake spoke a minute later. His voice didn't sound the same. I wonder where they're taking us. There's your answer, Janice replied from the port where he was standing. I can see Neptune almost dead ahead from here, and it's growing larger. Hours later, Venaric came in, bringing them a pasty kind of food that didn't taste too bad. Apparently nonchalant, but very watchful, he stood just inside the door while they ate. DeVries watched him in turn. Already he'd learned much just by observing Venaric's eyes, apparently the Proktols' only medium of emotion. Black, as his were now, meant calm, orange meant anger, and green meant amusement. When they had finished eating, Venaric started to leave without a word. DeVries stopped him. Would you mind telling us now where you're taking us and why? Careful not to lose his temper again. He figured it would do no harm and might do infinite good to learn as much as possible. Venaric hesitated, surveying him musingly. He then answered indirectly. Have you Earthmen ever heard of the sacred temple of Dorval or the Shining Stone? No, the Earthmen had never heard of either. Dorval, DeVries repeated. Is that your planet? Yes. And this Shining Stone? Venaric's eyes became green-tinged, and DeVries wondered why. The Shining Stone is merely a colorful meteoric fragment. Many years ago, it came flashing through space and landed on Dorval. The inhabitants are semi-savage and worshipped it, believing it a present from the gods. Of course, to such as we, he apparently meant himself and his companions, the Shining Stone means nothing, but the others are roused to a fanatical fury when it is touched. And when it is stolen... So you think we stole it? Janice said. We've never set foot on your planet. Venaric turned complacent black eyes upon him. No, Commander, I did not say that, because I know you did not steal it. Then why are you holding up? You will see soon. Kettrick, remembering that blow on the head, was regarding Venaric balefully, and Venaric was standing fairly close to him. Now Kettrick didn't move, merely turned his head and spat contemptuously in the Proktol's face. Venaric's hand leapt to his belt like a whiplash and snatched out the flame pistol. He pressed it hard against Kettrick's body before any of the men could move. The swift flood of the angry orange filled his eyes, but he did not press the button. The orange slowly faded and gave way to a deep purple, as though he were remembering something. Then it too faded. He jammed the pistol back in his belt, brought his hand up, and slapped Kettrick sharply across the mouth. Those fingers were long and wiry and shell-like. They left 4 furrows in Kettrick's cheek from which blood oozed, but he stood there stolidly, regarding Venaric with contempt. Venaric turned abruptly and left the room. "You damn fool," DeVries snapped. "Why did you do that?" "I don't like him," was all Kettrick said, as he slowly raised his hand to his cheek. "Oh, you don't? Well, he's not exactly in love with you now. He would have blasted you then, but he's got something else up his sleeve. I'd hate to be in your shoes." Janice said, "We'd all hate to be in our shoes, but it looks like we are. I don't like this shining stone business. Must be a pretty important fetish on their world, eh?" Blake muttered, "If it was stolen, I bet I know who got it. That damn pirate Perrin. You know we had information he was out this way." DeVries said, "No. I think there's something else behind all of this, something more than the shining stone, and I hate to think what." He was still remembering a mad Martian's story. Bells clanged. The vibration of the rocket ceased. Through the ports came a weird green glow as they passed close to the atmosphere of Neptune. The spacer swung around that planet, using its gravity as a pivot. Then the Earthmen saw the single tiny satellite which Venaric had called Dovril. An hour later they were there, slanting down over a terrain of desert and serrated cliffs. The great ball of Neptune hung behind, filling half the sky, its glow casting just enough light over the satellite to tinge everything with a greenish grotesquerie. "Lord, that gives me the creeps," Blake muttered, peering out. "This little planet must be pretty heavy, though," Janice estimated. "Gravity seems about right." They passed beyond the cliffs and over a large desert. Then, far ahead, they saw the towering stone edifices of a city, gleaming a ghastly skull-white in the green-tinged atmosphere. DeVries turned his face away. He recognized the city from the Martian's description. Before they quite reached there, however, Blake cried, "Look! Down there!" Far below them, covering a large section of desert, were row after row of blunt-nosed objects, looking like tiny silvery bugs, except they were motionless. But they weren't bugs. They were spaceships. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of them in formidable array. Kettrick stared, then turned to DeVries and exclaimed, "Ha! Thought you said these Proktols stuck close to home. Offhand, I'd say they got other ideas now. I wonder what. I don't like the look of that fleet down there." But now their spacer was gliding in low over the city, settling down into landing cradles. Janice turned to his men. "If we see a chance, we better make a break for it. I'd like to get at the controls of this ship just once." "I'd rather get at her atom blast," Kettrick snapped. But they had no chance to do either. A score of the Proktols, with flame pistols alert, came to escort them out. As they marched down a wide avenue, thousands of the gathered populace gave vent to prolonged shouting, or rather shrilling. It was definitely unfriendly and somehow fanatical, anticipatory. The Earthmen looked at these inhabitants with interest. They seemed to be Proktols too, but in several ways they were different from Venaric and the others. They were smaller, hardly 4 feet tall, and frailer if that were possible, and they had no antennae. Neither did they wear any raiment that the Earthmen could see, evidence of their semi-savagery. But they seemed to respect the larger Proktols, for although their shrilling continued, they kept their distance and didn't touch the Earthmen. "Just listen to those devils," Blake said. "They're waiting, expecting something." They reached a vast plaza in the center of the city. Their captors marched them through the mass of shrilling little coppery devils and into a building, then up a flight of stairs and into a bare stone room with a single tiny window looking out upon the square below. As the last of the Proktols passed out of the room, he pressed a key into a slot outside the doorway. A sheet of bluish crackling flame leapt up from the floor, effectively barring the entrance. Janice whirled to the window. A louder sound came swelling up from the tiny savages below as they caught sight of him. "Shut up! We haven't got your damn shining stone. I wish Venaric would tell him so," he added, coming away. "Sounds like they want our blood." De Vries had a better idea of what they wanted, but he kept still. They hadn't long to wait. Venaric came. He left some of his men outside, shutting off the electrical barrier, and stepped into the room and turned it on again. He held his flame pistol ready at his hand. "I am indeed sorry to have kept you waiting," he said with overemphasized politeness, "but I had to consult with Luxor as to your disposal. He has waited long. He is anxious to begin." "And who might he be?" asked Janice, glaring. Venaric turned serious black eyes upon him. "Luxor," he said, obviously seeking the right term, "is our word for what you Earthmen might call the greatest one, or the ultimate, or, more laterally, perhaps the brain." "The brain, eh?" Kettrick spoke up scornfully. "Well, if this brain of yours has half the sense it was born with, it'll think twice before—" Venaric turned on him with suddenly angry eyes, and Janice intervened quickly. "Just what is this brain, or Luxor? And if he's an authority here, why don't you take us to him?" "That is not necessary. He is interested in you, but very impersonally." Venaric's voice was cold. "I have been instructed to allow you to choose among yourselves who will be the one." "The one?" Blake whispered to De Vries. "What does he mean, the one?" "For the ritual," Venaric said, as though they should have known. "And suppose," Janice said, "none of us chooses to be the one?" Venaric shrugged in a purely Earthian manner and raised the flame pistol a bit higher. "Then it will be a pleasure for me to choose for you." "No, thanks." Janice glanced at the others questioningly, hesitated, then took a notebook from his pocket, tore a page into 4 strips of varying length. De Vries was watching his friends' faces. Either they didn't know what was going to happen, or were pretending not to. De Vries said, "You know what he means by the ritual. It's just his polite word for the torture I was telling you about." None of them answered, and he knew that they knew. Venaric's emotionless black eyes watched them. They drew, recklessly, and Blake held the shortest slip. His face went suddenly pale, but he did not say a word. Venaric was disappointed. He stared past Blake at Kettrick. He said, "I wish it were you." As his eyes tinged with the angry orange again, he glanced around at them. Then he went on musingly, "The Lactors need not know. And it can make no difference. Yes, it will be you." He gestured with the flame pistol. "That's all right with me," said Kettrick contemptuously. Blake started to protest, but Kettrick brushed him aside. "It's all right. I know what I'm doing. I defy these devils to do their worst." But he flashed them a look that said, "Be ready." But Venaric watched too closely. As they moved to the doorway, he kept the pistol trained. He produced the key that shut off the electrical barrier. They passed outside, and it leapt up again. The 3 men inside could dimly see through it, and they saw Venaric's eyes turn away for a half a second. Kettrick bent and lunged forward in one swift motion, flooring the frail Proktol in a vicious tackle. He snatched up the flame pistol and sprayed it in a semicircle as other Proktols came rushing in. 4 or 5 fell with holes burned through their frail bodies. Still others came. Kettrick's arms flailed. His fist caught one squarely in the middle, and the brittle shell-like skin popped open in a wide gap as a thick, colorless fluid oozed out. He hit another in the head. Something snapped, and the head dangled grotesquely. Kettrick's knee came up, and another Proktol popped open, exuding a viscous stuff. But there had been too many out there waiting. Their bodies were frail, but their limbs were like steel cables. The men just inside the room could only look on helplessly as Kettrick went down, still swinging elbows and knees. A dozen wiry arms lashed him to the floor. Venaric rose to his feet, staggering a little. Holding his middle as though he wished to vomit, he snatched a flame pistol, aimed it, and changed his mind. He gave a staccato command in his own language. "Can't blame me for trying," Kettrick sang out to his friends as he was hurried down the stairs. Through the window they could see the horde of tiny Proktols still gathered in the square below. Suddenly the murmuring leapt to a louder clamor. Then they saw the reason for it. Kettrick was being dragged out into the square, through the throng toward a little dais. From the dais rose a single pillar of stone. They fastened him securely to the pillar. The clamoring subsided a little. Those savages were waiting for something, just as the 3 Earthmen were waiting, watching the scene below them. Some of the larger Proktols brought a huge metal disc, perhaps 3 feet in diameter. A hole was in the center. They put it over Kettrick's head, and it rested on his shoulders. "I don't like the looks of that," Janice muttered tensely. "What are they going to do?" But they weren't through. Next, over Kettrick's head, they placed a spacious wire cage, which clicked into place on the rim of the disc. "My God," Blake said, suddenly staring. "Do you suppose they're going to run some kind of voltage through that thing?" "That's a nice, pleasant thought," Janice snapped at him. DeVries turned away from them both. He knew better. "No," he told Blake hoarsely. "No, not that. Better come away." But they couldn't come away. Horror, especially an unknown horror, has a fascination. They saw some of the Proktols seemingly in consultation. Presently a couple of them hurried away, and all that could be heard from that massed throng was a gentle murmuring as they swayed restlessly, waiting. Then in the room behind them they heard the electrical crackling in the doorway cease. Venaric stood before them again, ever watchful with the flame pistol. "That was a very noble effort on the part of your friend," he said, "but quite useless, as you can see. Moreover, he killed some of my men, and I do not think he helped the rest of you by that." His eyes glittered. "Yes, before the ritual ends this time, I think all of you will have participated." "We haven't got your damn shining stone," Blake grated through clenched teeth, "and we never even heard of it." "The shining stone? Oh, yes. I had quite forgotten I told you about it. But I neglected to say that it is quite safe. It is always quite safe, even when it is stolen. Because, you see, we stole it." "You stole it?" Janice repeated. "But didn't you say the stone meant little to such as you?" "Only as a means to an end. Commander Janice, you are a scientific man above all else. For that reason, I respect you as much as I despise your stupid friend down there. I shall explain the ritual you are about to witness. First, those little savages think you Earthmen stole their shining stone because we wish them to think that, and you could never convince them otherwise. Therefore, they must have their revenge. All this is very necessary for a certain reason you will understand shortly." "I'm beginning to already," Blake said bitterly. "It's a high-powered racket and we're the fall guys." Varnick looked at him as though he didn't quite understand such English words. A sudden, louder murmur came up from below. "It has begun," Varnick said, nodding toward the window. "If you will observe, please." The men turned back to the window and watched. DeVries at least half knew what to expect, but he felt the other two tense beside him as they realized the purpose of that cage over Kettrick's head. A little door in the side of it was open, and one of the official Proktols was thrusting several tiny animals inside. They were sharp-fanged, scaled, almost reptilian, but they had beady little rodent eyes, and the eyes blinked as the animals scurried around the disc under the cage. Kettrick's head jerked convulsively at the nearness of them. "Little inhabitants of our desert," came Venaric's calm voice across the room behind them. "Ordinarily quite tame and harmless, but these are trained for this. They are very hungry." The Earthmen's minds were too numbed just then. They didn't feel the full horror until some time later. They just stood there in terrible fascination, staring down, unable to move, and behind them they could still hear Venaric's cold voice as though he were a classroom lecturer. He didn't even need to look as he spoke. He knew what was happening. He had seen this many times. "The little creatures are a bit restless now. I imagine the way your friend moves his head frightens them, but they will become used to that presently, and then their work will begin." But something else was happening down there. The crowd had become silent, not even a murmuring. They all seemed to be looking in the same direction, away from the dais where the Earthman was fastened. Then a path opened up. A procession of the large Proktols came through, with something on a movable platform in the midst of them. Again Venaric's voice. "I suppose lactose is entering now, or the brain, as you would undoubtedly call it." "Good Lord, yes," Janice murmured at last, staring. "That's what I'd call it, for that's what it is." End of section 1 of 11 stories by Louis Hasse.